Okay, so the whole process is called hematopoiesis. And yes, you do need to know that term, and you do need to know how to spell that term. No, I'm not going to ding you points if you misspell it on the test, but I told you that we're building a knowledge base. We continue to do that, and this is one of those terms that you're really going to need to know, because whatever you go into, you're almost certain to encounter this. Okay? And the hematopoietic cells themselves will divide into two types of stem cells: myeloid and lymphoid. Myeloid and lymphoid. These can also give rise to cancer. If you ever hear of myeloma or multiple myeloma, that's from myeloid cells that just start going crazy. Anybody here ever heard of lymphoma? Mm-hmm. It's a form of leukemia. It's the lymphoid cells that start to go. Of the two, the myeloid cells are a bit more generalized, because they can still become red, white, or platelet. The thing is, they can only become a certain type of white blood cells. Is everybody clear on that? The lymphoid cells are always going to be specialized white cells. I am not going to ask you to know the 5 different types of monopotent stem cells. If you look at figure 14.3, erythroblast, megakaryoblast, myeloblast, monoblast, lymphoblast. That's getting just a little too lost in the weeds, don't you all think? Annalise just like, bring it on. I just want you to be aware there is another step between myeloid and lymphoid and the final product. Is everybody clear on that? So myeloid cells can become, most of them actually will become red blood cells. The correct term for a red blood cell is erythrocyte. Erythrocyte. Yes, you will need to know that term. Remember, better than 99% of the blood cells are going to be erythrocytes. The body is constantly making new erythrocytes. It is constantly supplying those to the circulatory system, generally through the spleen. The spleen is also constantly pulling old erythrocytes or damaged erythrocytes out of the bloodstream. And those, once they get pulled out, they're broken down by white blood cells. The damage comes from erythrocytes passing through capillaries. Some capillaries are actually smaller than a single red blood cell. As the heart beats, you get that pressure wave continually pulsing, and it pushes those cells through. Anybody in here ever played on bumper cars at the fair? Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter how much a driver you are, you're going to get bumped or you're going to bump something, aren't you? Demolition Derby, y'all seen that? Same thing. You're going to get dings. It may or may not decrease the function of the cell at the time, but the accumulated damage will take a toll. Make sure you understand that. So in the red marrow, you've got the hematopoietic cell, which will divide into a myeloid cell. The myeloid cell will then divide and produce what we call an erythroblast, And that's a monopotent stem cell that's just going to give rise to a new erythrocyte. Once that cell divides, the protoerythrocyte is going to undergo some modification. What a lot of people don't realize are that red blood cells do not contain nuclei. After division from the erythroblast, the protoerythrocyte is going to lose its nucleus. It's going to go to the edge of the cell, the plasma membrane will invaginate, and it will pinch it off. It will then be broken down and recycled again by white blood cells. The reason for that, the red blood cell is not transcriptionally active. It is not transcriptionally active. Yes, you need to know that term. It is not making its own proteins. Proteins get damaged, don't they? They wear out, don't they? In a stem cell or in another cell that's active, it has its own nucleus, it has its own peptide-making machinery. You'll make proteins to replace those. Erythrocytes don't, they wear out, they're recycled entirely. Everybody clear on that? You may hear the term reticulocyte. A reticulocyte is just an erythrocyte that's still developing. They may be released into the blood. A reticulum is just a network. It comes from the Latin word for net. If you ever watch any of these old gladiator movies, you got the guy that throws the net on people. He's called a retiarius, net fighter. Nikki's like, what relevance does that have to anything? It doesn't. I just get to show off. I know more than you. What's the function of a red blood cell?
I swear I had it.
Huh?
It like sends like blood through like your veins, like
No,
oxygen.
that's the heart.
Transports oxygen.
Yeah. Let's say it transports gases. If you put transport oxygen on the test, am I going to ding you points? But I want you to remember it's not just oxygen.
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide is also transported. Whenever it gets to the destination, whatever the destination may be, the hemoglobin in that red blood cell is going to give up a molecule of oxygen. In return, it's going to take a molecule of CO2. Once they go through the lungs, they're going to release that CO2 molecule. They're going to take in another molecule of oxygen, and the cycle repeats. True or false? The respiratory system can detect a lack of oxygen. How many of you say yes? Hands up. False. Believe it or not, you don't have a way to consciously detect on the large scale a lack of oxygen. In fact, they have actually put forth yet another method of execution. Did y'all know this? Used to be they hung people. Too brutal. What's the guy that stole all of Tesla's ideas? Edison. We'll electrocute people. Too brutal. We'll gas people. Too much like the Nazis. So they start lethal injection. Now they can't find veins. What they do is they actually are doing what they call nitrogen suffocation. They put somebody in a room and they gradually draw the air out and replace it with atmospheric nitrogen. The nitrogen is inert. If you're breathing in nitrogen, are you getting oxygen? See where this is going? You become hypoxic, you go unconscious, you essentially suffocate because you're breathing in inert gas. What the body detects is too much CO2. The coughing reflex, the drowning reflex, the gag reflex, all of that comes from too much CO2 in the blood. That's why you can't hold your breath, because you're getting too much CO2 in your lungs. True or false? If you inhale what you just exhaled, you will suffocate immediately.
That's false.
That's false. Atmospheric oxygen is about 21%. When you exhale, it's about 16% oxygen. This is how you're able to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation or rescue breathing or whatever the politically correct term is this year. What is it? They keep changing it. What is the correct term this year? It used to be mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I got somebody got on
Now
me.
it's just CPR. That's what.
Somebody got on me and said, it's rescue breathing.
Well, yeah, they call it 30 rescue breaths, but you gotta like do a 10-minute, like, or not 10-minute, but a 10-second like pause.
Now,
Like,
eventually, if you can't breathe in more, you will suffocate. But that's a different thing than hypoxia. Does everybody see that? What happens when the amount of oxygen gets too low in the bloodstream? The body will release a protein called erythropoietin. This in turn stimulates the formation of red blood cells. If you just want to use the abbreviation capital E, capital P, capital O for erythropoietin, I'm okay with that. It's actually released by the kidneys, surprisingly. What this does is it stimulates cell division and differentiation. So you kick up the number of erythrocytes. And the reverse is true. It's a negative feedback mechanism. So if the amount of oxygen gets too high, it will shut down that pathway until the red blood cell levels drop. Everybody cool with that? Now I want you to understand, this is not a nervous response. It's not a neural impulse. It's a hormonal response. And if you remember, we said hormonal responses are systemic. They're not as quick, but they tend to last longer. To me, one of the best scams I've ever heard of in history is called mountain climbing. Y'all ever heard of this? Rich people with too much money pay a bunch of locals in Tibet or Nepal or one of those countries something like $100,000 to get a permit to strap a couple of oxygen tanks on their back, climb 6 miles into the sky, spend the night in freezing temperatures in what we call the death zone when there's not enough atmospheric oxygen to survive, and then hope they don't die before they get back down the mountain. And before you think I'm being sarcastic, every bit of what I said is just true. Except some people think it's fun. Kylie's like, I'm standing right here with you. They call it the death zone for a reason, don't they? What most people don't know is if you're planning on doing that, going up one of the 8,000 meter peaks, you'll actually spend several weeks at what they call base camp. You're literally just sitting on your bottom at the base of the mountain, in a tent. And you have to do that for several weeks. The reason is you're raising the number of erythrocytes in your bloodstream. So that when you start going up the mountain and you get less and less atmospheric oxygen, you're actually being able to absorb more and more of what there is. Didn't know that, did you? That process is called acclimatization. Acclimatization. You become acclimated. And if anybody wants to be a mountain climber or is, I apologize for my snarkiness. I just have never understood that particular hobby. Did y'all know there's so many dead bodies on Mount Everest that they use them as landmarks? Turn left at Green Boots. I'm serious. If you don't believe me, Google Mount Everest Green Boots and you'll get a picture of a frozen corpse laying there. No, that doesn't mean you should go hunting for it right now. Any questions about erythrocytes? Typical blood counts or cell counts for red blood cells. For women, it's about 4.7 million per milliliter. For men, it's a little bit higher, about 5.4. And that's primarily due to the simple fact that men tend to have a bigger body size. There are ranges like everything. You can be on the high end, you can be on the low end. A lot of it also depends on genetics and location. Genetics and location. Some of the Sherpas, who are the native people in, say, Nepal, will have a much higher account of red blood cells just simply because they live in the Himalayas. Genetically, they actually have more efficient hemoglobin than we do. It's pretty cool, isn't it? So any questions about this? Can you get too many red blood cells? We talked about anemia, a lack of red blood cells. The reverse of this is true. It's called polycythemia. Polycythemia. And this is very often due to something inhibiting the absorption of oxygen. High altitude. Dehydration. Smoking. This is rarely something that will have a long-term or significant impact. It tends to be self-correcting. Anemia is a lack of hemoglobin or a lack of red blood cells, either one. Table 14.2 does a pretty good job of breaking down the causes and different types of anemia. But the main two are going to be hemorrhagic anemia, which just means you bleed. Now keep in mind that doesn't necessarily mean you've had a deep wound. For a woman, especially a woman who's on the smaller side has a smaller body, a heavy menstrual period could actually trigger hemorrhagic anemia. Is everybody clear on that? Certain infectious diseases like hemorrhagic fever, Ebola, can cause that as well. It's not a wound, it's caused by an infectious disease. The other one is more likely we might encounter would be iron deficiency anemia. Iron deficiency anemia. It's not quite the same thing as hemorrhagic because you're not losing the blood, but if you have lost a significant amount and you don't eat a sufficient iron, it will linger. Even though you produce more blood cells, they just don't have as much hemoglobin. That one is primarily dietary. Primarily dietary. Questions? I seem to have beaten you all into submission today. All right, next up, we're going to talk about white blood cells. White blood cells. White blood cells have one function. Can anybody tell me what it is?
Infection, right?
Close. There's a proper term for that. The immune response or the immune system. And there's a lot of things that are encompassed under that heading. The first thing I want to make you aware of is something called the inflammatory response. The inflammatory response is initiated by, number one, damage to the body. Number two, an invasion of the body. Number three, a malfunction of the system. Has anybody in here ever sprained your ankle? Hands up if you have. Most of us have, right? First symptom you get is pain, right? Let you know there is some damage to that tissue. What happens next? Hands up, somebody. Olivia, what happens after you sprain your ankle? Huh? You go to the doctor. I'm saying what happens to your ankle, dear Nikki?
Swelling.
Swelling. What else? What do they tell you to put on it?
Ice.
I'm going to let Nikki teach the class. The rest of you need to get conscious. They tell you to put ice because it gets hot, doesn't it? It turns red. This is due to the inflammatory response. When you get sick, you start to get symptoms, don't you, depending on the locale. If it's a respiratory infection, you're going to almost immediately get a runny nose, aren't you? You're going to get congested. You may start coughing. Your throat gets sore. If you get an infected zit or boil, is it going to swell? Is it going to turn red and hot? All of this is due to the inflammatory response. The very first thing that happens, chemicals are released as the damage is detected. Chemicals are released as the damage is detected. These chemicals are typically going to be cytokines. Cytokines are small proteins that are secreted by the white blood cells. What they do, and this is the thing I want you to get, they initiate an immediate response from the immune system. This is the inflammatory response. Inflammation. The first thing that's going to happen is the blood vessels are going to dilate. They're going to open up. Vasodilation. This means you get an increase of blood flow to the affected area. That in turn is going to result in a localized increase in body temperature. This in turn is going to give you an increase in a reddish color. Blood's red. You put more blood through there, it's going to turn red, isn't it? However, the leakage between the blood cells is what causes the swelling. Basically, the cells of the blood vessels are going to do this. Everybody see? Normally they're sealed tightly, aren't they? They're going to open small gaps like this. And plasma is going to leak out into the extracellular space. The technical term for this is edema. E-D-E-M-A, means swelling. Anytime you see swelling or have swelling, it's almost always going to be due to an inflammatory response. Is everyone clear on that? That results in, number one, the white blood cells move out of the bloodstream and into the extracellular space. Number two, it increases the volume of the extracellular space. If this is due to an infection, viruses or bacteria in that space, those white blood cells are going to immediately engage the invader. They're going to start consuming them through phagocytosis is the term for that. P-H-A-G-O-C-Y-T-O-S-I-S, phagocytosis. And they're literally going to eat until they burst. So now you've got a bunch of partially digested bacteria, you've got a burst white blood cell, and you've got more junk floating around in there, right? Here come more white blood cells. You see where I'm going with this? If it is a localized infection, all of that cellular debris that is left over from the engagement or the fight is going to form a nasty liquid called pus, P-U-S. If you've ever popped a zit and you had that nasty tan-colored goop come out, that's pus. You see why an increased volume is key there? Because it gives the space for the white blood cells to travel through and to fight the invader. Generally, the inflammatory response will remain in place until the infection is defeated and or the tissue is repaired. When I talk about the inflammatory response, those are the three things I want you to know. Swelling, increased blood flow, and white blood cells filling the area. The immune system as a whole will also stimulate repair, but that's getting a little bit more detailed than just a chapter on blood should have. If there is nothing for the white blood cells to fight, if it's due to tissue damage, like what you see with a sprained ankle, the white blood cells will very often break down and recycle the damaged tissue. But as soon as the tissue reaches a sufficient state of repair, the body is going to shut off the inflammatory response. The swelling goes down, the redness goes away, the pain gets less. When they tell you to put ice on a sprained ankle or a sore muscle, what they are doing is they're basically telling you to try to lower the physical temperature to inhibit the inflammatory response. It just makes it heal quicker, you get less pain. Everybody cool with that? What happens in case number 3? A malfunction. Well, this can come from 2 things. Number 1, you breathe in something from the outside that is not infectious but doesn't belong in your body. Here in southern Kentucky, we know that we don't get spring, we get pollen, don't we? We don't just get the spring season, we get pollen. They should have a separate season called pollen. You pull up here at 9:30 in the morning, you just took your nice new car through the car wash, you go out here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and my nice wine-colored car is now covered in pale yellow. We've all had this, haven't we? Y'all want me to gross you out? Never stop to think about this, but what you're doing is you're breathing in plant sperm. Lots and lots of it. A couple of you getting red-faced. That's an immune response right there. Joking aside, is that something that's normally found in your body? Your body very often will recognize it as an invader, and it will initiate a systemic immune response. We know that as seasonal allergies. Inflammatory response. If you get contact dermatitis, is that an inflammatory response, Abby? Yeah, gets red, starts to swell up a little bit, doesn't it? If I were to put on rubber gloves, I'm going to break out in hives right here and right here, because I'm now sensitized to that. The point there is, it's a malfunction insofar as whatever you're in contact with, whatever you've inhaled, whatever you ingested, is not an actual invader. There's no harm to you that results from the presence of that stuff. But your body can only tell that it's foreign, not whether or not it's dangerous. So it goes ahead and it initiates the response. How many of you have allergies of any kind? Hand up. Very typical. The truth is, you can become allergic to anything at any time. It's what a process called sensitization. Sensitization. Sensitization has a threshold. Exposure below the threshold does not initiate the response. Once repeated exposure exceeds the threshold, you have initiated the response. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? Everybody okay with that? You awake? Once you are sensitized, the threshold is lowered significantly. Even a minute exposure at that point will initiate the response. When I was your age and up through my 20s, I was in graduate school, right? I was working in a research lab. I was wearing latex gloves every day, 8-10 hours a day. No rash, no dermatitis, no problem. Got a job teaching. As you've seen last week, sometimes we have to use gloves in teaching, don't we? I had been teaching for about 6 or 7 years as a professor. Did a lab, put on my gloves. After the lab, dang it, what on earth? I had this ridge or row of just little bumps. Never saw that rash before. Within an hour of taking the gloves off, it went away. Congratulations, I now own a latex allergy. See how I got sensitized? Repeated constant exposure to high levels over an extended period of time. Repeated constant exposure to high levels over an extended period of time. The second type of immune system malfunction is when the immune system misrecognizes a part of the body. These white cells, as they're tumbling and moving through the blood, basically come into contact with antigens. You remember we talked about antigens with blood type, right? Those antigens are either self or non-self. That's all it's capable of recognizing. In some cases, something is called hypoallergenic. 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 Something that's hypoallergenic isn't even detected by the immune system. It's stealth. That's why my O negative blood is so desirable. It's stealth mode. Things like titanium, alloys that are used in joint replacements, they're hypoallergenic. That's very important if you're going to be putting any kind of foreign substance into the body, especially for a long term. Now, I don't even think we had any latex gloves in there, did we? They were all nitrile. Nitrile is typically a hyperallergenic substance. You get the idea? If it's non-self, well, that's what the immune system's for, right? Even if it's a pollen grain, which isn't going to germinate and cause you to, have a tree growing in your lungs or something, it still doesn't belong. So allergies, even though it's mistaking it as an invader, it's still normal function. Autoimmune responses are the biggest malfunction of all. For whatever reason, the immune cells, those white blood cells, stop recognizing the surface antigens of certain tissues as self. They become non-self. They are seen as an invader. And they can initiate an immune response. Take a 5-minute break, then come back. If you want to step outside and smoke them if you got them.
Yeah, buddy.
Was something that happened over a century ago. Is anybody in here familiar with the Spanish flu of 1918? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. It is either number 1 or number 2 on the deadliest pandemics in human history. Everybody's heard of the Black Death, right? 1348, 1349. The Black Death probably killed between 25 to 50 million people. The highest estimate I've ever seen on it is 25 million, 50 million. I have seen estimates on the flu pandemic go all the way to 100 million. We just didn't have the record keeping 700 years ago like we do today, right? So that's why we don't know exactly which. But I'd say the flu has probably killed more than the plague. The reason for this, and this is actually probably true of the Black Death as well. What killed the most people was not the flu. Didn't know that, did you? It was something called a cytokine storm. A cytokine storm. So many cytokines were released by the immune system that they produced so much of a response. The damage to the lungs was compared by doctors at the time to damage that had been inflicted by chemical weapons. That's pretty bad. It also meant you had massive amounts of fluid in the lungs, which also meant, in turn, pneumonia. Devastating pneumonia. Everybody still with me here? Why did the 1918 flu produce such a response? Well, you have to look at the timing of it. The first reported case occurred in March of 1918. It was like a very bad case of the regular seasonal flu that circulates every spring in North America. It started infecting soldiers at Fort Riley, Kansas, who were being mobilized for World War I. Thing is, it didn't kill a lot of people. It just infected them, took them down for a few days, a couple of weeks, then it moved on. Spread across the sea into Europe, where the war was undergoing. It inflicted so many seasonal casualties on the German army that their spring offensive failed. Yeah, obviously not the only thing, but it did play a major role. And then, near the end of summer, they thought it was gone. Late September, early October, it came back with a vengeance. The last 3 months of 1918 were like every bad thing you ever heard about COVID on steroids. People were dying by the thousands per day. Everything shut down. They were making people wear masks. This is before we have effective vaccines against the flu. That second wave is the one that is so deadly. Would y'all like to know why?
It mutates.
What'd you say?
It mutates.
It mutates. Oh, does it mutate? The thing about flu is it has a little trick called an antigenic shift. An antigenic shift. Most bugs, microbes, viruses, bacteria undergo what we call antigenic drift. You ever looked at how models of cars change over the years? You can generally identify the model of the car by the shape or the appearance, right? They might change the headlights from last year to this year. Next year they'll add a spoiler. But you can tell that they're all a Nissan Rogue Sport made in the early 2020s. See where I'm going with this? That's antigenic drift. It is small changes that are gradual. Small, gradual changes. That's the norm. So if your immune system is exposed to a new variant of the flu, or of the cold, let's say, a cold virus, your immune system has probably been exposed to something like that before, hasn't it? I would be willing to bet most of you could visualize what a Nissan Rogue Sport looks like. Am I right? You've probably seen one if you knew what cars were. Y'all know what an SUV is? If you want to see one, you can look out the window. There's a little maroon colored one down there. It's what I drive. My point is, you wouldn't look twice at it. Even if I asked you to identify the year, you couldn't. If I had another one parked nearby that was a 2024, you could tell that there's a couple of years difference, couldn't you? Might not know the exact year, but again, you've seen it before. It's not something that looks unique. It's not weird. Now, if I drove one of those Tesla Cybertrucks that looks kind of like some kind of cracker box on wheels, y'all ever seen those things? I don't know why they call it a truck. It doesn't have a bed. It's got a sloped metal panel. I don't know if the panel goes up or what. It's like, I guarantee you, if I pulled up in one of those things, you would notice it because it is so weird and unique, you've never seen anything like it. That is what the 1918 second wave looked like. It was so different that it wasn't even recognizable as a Nissan Rogue. The label said Nissan Rogue, but it didn't look anything like it. You see where I'm going with this? Has your immune system ever seen anything like that? So the immune system doesn't know how to handle it, and it literally goes crazy. A cytokine storm is initiated because every single white blood cell that comes into contact with one of those new flu viruses releases more cytokines. What happens to the concentration of cytokines in the bloodstream? It goes up. What happens to the immune response? It goes up. And basically, you get a response that's almost like anaphylaxis. And the really sad thing was, most of the people who died during the second wave weren't the old, the young, or the immunocompromised, who are the usual victims of an infectious disease, right? Because they can't fight off the infection. Since it was a hyper response, it was killing mostly people in their 20s and 30s in the prime of life. And that is why they were so concerned about COVID. Because the coronavirus that causes COVID is something that the human immune system had never seen. And they were worried about having a pandemic, not of the level we had, which was bad enough, but it very easily could have been a repeat of the 1918 flu. Does that help clarify some things? Olivia's like, I don't care, just shut up, leave me alone. Well, I know, you've got a reason to feel bad. You're recovering. Morgan's like, shut up, leave me alone. You're the one signed up for dual credit. Would you all like a more passive lab experience or a more active lab experience?
Can you elaborate a little bit?
Huh?
Can you elaborate a little bit?
A passive lab experience would be a case study, which might be easier on you all given your passivity and lack of, in general, energy, because it would certainly take you the whole period to do it. An active lab means you actually have to get up out of your chair. And horror of horrors, you have to walk to the lab. And you have to interact with each other and models and diagrams and pictures. So how many vote for case study? I know what's going to happen next. Nobody's going to vote for either. How many of you vote for the more active lab? Kylie's like, I'm not participating. I'm sitting this election out. Both candidates suck. You definitely sound like an American voter. I don't care what we do.